Captain Sarah Chen stood before the curved viewing screen of the diplomatic vessel Harmony's Edge, watching the massive space station known as the Nexus grow larger with each passing moment. The structure was a testament to galactic cooperation, a spinning wheel of metal and crystal that housed representatives from over 300 different species. Today, it would host what many considered the most important trial in galactic history. The comm system crackled to life. "Captain Chen, this is Nexus Control. You are cleared for Docking Bay 7. Please note that all weapons, combat enhancement devices, and biological threats must be declared upon arrival." Sarah glanced at the small travel carrier sitting on the chair beside her pilot's seat. Through the mesh window, she could see her companion sleeping peacefully, a small German Shepherd puppy named Rex. At 6 months old, he was all oversized ears and clumsy paws, with the kind of innocent expression that made even hardened space traders smile. "Nexus Control, this is Captain Chen. I'm carrying one Earth K9, non-threatening, for emotional support during the proceedings. All documentation is current and approved by your Biological Safety Committee. Acknowledged, Captain. Please proceed to your assigned docking bay." Sarah couldn't help but shake her head at the irony. The Galactic Council had spent the better part of 3 years debating whether humanity deserved a place among the civilized species of the galaxy. They had tested human strength, intelligence, technological capability, and diplomatic skills. They had examined humanity's history of warfare, their capacity for both creation and destruction, their ability to work with other species. What they hadn't understood was that humans had never truly fought alone. The docking procedure was smooth, and, within an hour, Sarah found herself walking through the pristine corridors of the Nexus. Rex trotted beside her on a simple leash, his tail wagging as he took in the strange new smells and sights. Other species gave them a wide berth, not out of fear, but out of the careful politeness that governed all interactions in neutral space. The Grand Assembly Hall was a marvel of engineering, designed to accommodate the vastly different environmental needs of hundreds of species. The air was kept at a comfortable temperature for most carbon-based life forms, with localized atmospheric controls for those who required different conditions. The floor was arranged in concentric circles, with the most influential species occupying the inner rings. Humanity had been assigned a position in the outer circle, befitting their status as applicants rather than members. Sarah took her designated seat, placing Rex's carrier on the floor beside her. The puppy had woken up during the walk and was now pressing his nose against the mesh, trying to see everything at once. The session was called to order by High Arbitrator Vexhai, a towering insectoid being whose species had been among the founding members of the Council. Their voice carried across the hall through universal translators, each word carefully modulated for maximum clarity. "We gather today to conclude the evaluation of species designation 7741 Terra, commonly known as humans. Over the past 36 months, this council has conducted extensive analysis of their civilization, capabilities, and potential contribution to galactic society." Sarah listened as the arbitrator outlined the various tests humanity had undergone. They had performed admirably in most categories. Human technology, while not the most advanced in the galaxy, showed remarkable adaptability and innovation. Human diplomats had proven capable of negotiating with species whose thought processes were completely alien to their own. Human artists and scientists had already begun contributing to the shared knowledge base that was one of the Council's greatest achievements. But there were concerns. The primary issue, continued High Arbitrator Vexhai, remains humanity's history of violence and their relationship with conflict. While humans have demonstrated remarkable progress in reducing warfare on their homeworld, their military capabilities and strategic thinking continue to concern many council members. Representative Thysska of the Serpentine Collective rose to speak. Her species was known for their analytical minds and their ability to see patterns across vast timescales. "The humans have shown us their capacity for cooperation, but we must not forget that they evolved as persistence hunters. Their entire social structure is built around the concept of tracking prey across vast distances until it collapses from exhaustion. How can we trust a species whose fundamental nature is predicated on wearing down their enemies?" A murmur of agreement rippled through several sections of the assembly. Sarah felt a familiar tightness in her chest. This was the same argument that had been raised repeatedly throughout the evaluation process. No matter how much evidence humanity provided of their peaceful intentions, their evolutionary history as hunters continued to cast doubt on their suitability for galactic civilization. But Representative Thysska wasn't finished. Furthermore, humans maintain an unusual psychological bond with predatory animals. They domesticate carnivorous species and treat them as companions. This suggests a dangerous romanticization of predatory behavior that could manifest in their interactions with other galactic species. All eyes turned to Sarah and the small carrier beside her. Rex had fallen asleep again, but his presence suddenly felt much more significant. The Council's concern about humanity's relationship with domesticated animals wasn't new, but having it brought up so directly in the final session was unexpected. High Arbitrator Vexhai gestured toward Sarah. Captain Chen, as humanity's representative, you have the opportunity to address these concerns. How do you respond to the assertion that your species' nature makes you unsuitable for galactic citizenship? Sarah rose slowly, her mind racing. She had prepared for this question, had practiced her response countless times with the diplomatic team back on Earth. But, standing here, surrounded by beings who had already made up their minds about humanity's violent nature, the careful words she had memorized suddenly felt inadequate. Instead, she found herself looking down at Rex, who had woken up and was watching her with bright, intelligent eyes. Honored arbitrator, esteemed representatives, she began, I understand your concerns about humanity's evolutionary history. It's true that we evolved as persistence hunters. It's true that we have a complex relationship with both cooperation and competition. And it's true that we maintain close bonds with other Earth species, including predatory ones. She paused, gathering her thoughts. But I think there's something the Council has failed to understand about these relationships. We didn't domesticate other species because we romanticize predation. We formed partnerships with them because we recognized something essential about survival that many galactic species have forgotten. The hall fell silent. Even the ambient noise of the life support systems seemed to fade as every being present focused on her words. Survival isn't about being the strongest or the most dangerous, Sarah continued. It's about adaptability. It's about forming alliances. It's about understanding that sometimes the best way to face a threat isn't to become a bigger threat yourself, but to work with someone who has different strengths than you do. She knelt down and opened Rex's carrier. The puppy bounded out, immediately sitting at her feet and looking up at her with complete trust. The simple gesture caused a stir throughout the assembly. Several representatives leaned forward, studying the small animal with new interest. This is Rex, Sarah said, gently scratching behind the puppy's ears. His ancestors were wolves, apex predators on our homeworld. But, thousands of years ago, humans and wolves made a choice. Instead of competing with each other, we decided to work together. Wolves gained reliable food sources and protection. Humans gained hunting partners, guards, and companions who could sense dangers we couldn't. Rex wagged his tail, oblivious to the momentous nature of the occasion. To him, this was just another new place full of interesting smells and people who might give him attention. The relationship evolved over millennia, Sarah continued. We shaped each other. Wolves became dogs, developing new capabilities and new forms of intelligence. Humans became more effective hunters and, eventually more effective farmers, builders, and explorers. Neither species became what they are today without the other. Representative HFY Sci's voice cut through the hall. This proves our point, Captain Chen. You speak of shaping other species to serve your purposes. How is this different from the predatory behavior we fear you might exhibit toward council members? Sarah looked directly at the Serpentine representative. Because the relationship was mutual, Representative HFY Sci. We didn't conquer wolves. We invited them to become partners. And, in accepting that invitation, both species became something greater than they were alone. She gestured to Rex, who was now sniffing curiously in the direction of a nearby crystalline delegate whose body naturally emitted a faint harmonic resonance. Dogs didn't lose their predatory instincts. They refined them. They learned to hunt threats to their human partners instead of hunting their human partners. They developed an intelligence that could complement human intelligence rather than compete with it. The crystalline delegate, intrigued by the small creature's apparent interest in their sonic emissions, extended one of their faceted appendages. Rex sniffed it carefully, then sat down and tilted his head in what Sarah recognized as his thinking pose. The harmonic resonance from the crystalline seemed to fascinate him. Your evaluation of humanity has focused on our capacity for violence, Sarah said, watching as Rex continued his careful examination of the alien being. But, you've missed the more important question, what do we choose to do with that capacity? High Arbitrator Vexhai leaned forward. Elaborate, Captain Chen. Every species in this council achieved their current status through competition, conflict, or conquest at some point in their history. The Vortak hegemony built their civilization on the ruins of 6 other species they absorbed. The Quantum Collective exists because they were able to militarily defeat 3 separate invasion attempts. The Crystalline Resonance achieved their current form by successfully defending their homeworld against a planet-eating entity. Sarah's voice gained strength as she continued. The difference isn't that humans are more violent than other species. The difference is what we've learned to do with our predatory instincts. We've learned to channel them into protection rather than conquest. We've learned to hunt problems instead of people. She looked around the assembly, making eye contact with representatives from dozens of different species. You want to know if humanity can be trusted with galactic citizenship? Then, look at what we've chosen to do with our most successful partnership. Rex had grown bored with the crystalline delegate and was now investigating a small puddle of water that had condensed near an environmental control unit. His tail continued to wag as he explored, completely unthreatened by the presence of hundreds of alien beings. For over 15,000 years, humans and dogs have shared the same world, Sarah said. Dogs have the physical capability to kill humans. They have sharp teeth, powerful jaws, and quick reflexes. But, in all that time, dogs have chosen to use those capabilities to protect humans, not harm them. And humans have chosen to use our intelligence and technology to care for dogs, not exploit them. Representative THYSSK was silent for a long moment, her serpentine head tilted in thought. You're suggesting that this partnership demonstrates humanity's capacity for benevolent leadership? I'm suggesting it demonstrates humanity's capacity for genuine cooperation, Sarah replied. We don't want to rule the galaxy, Representative THYSSK. We want to be part of it. We want to contribute our strengths while learning from the strengths of others. A new voice entered the discussion. Representative Korth of the Silicon Brotherhood, a species known for their logical approach to all problems, spoke in their characteristic monotone. Captain Chen, your argument is intriguing, but it relies on a single example. How do we know that humanity's relationship with canines represents a pattern rather than an anomaly? Sarah smiled. Because it's not a single example, Representative Korth. Humans have formed similar partnerships with hundreds of other Earth species. We work with horses for transportation and labor. We partner with birds of prey for hunting. We maintain symbiotic relationships with plants for food production. We've even learned to cooperate with some of our former competitors. She paused, letting the implications sink in. But, more importantly, we've already begun forming those same kinds of partnerships beyond Earth. Human colonies have successfully integrated with native species on 7 different worlds. In each case, both species have benefited from the cooperation. The hall erupted in surprised murmurs. Several representatives immediately began accessing their data networks, verifying Sarah's claims. The information was publicly available, but few council members had considered its significance. High Arbitrator Vexhai called for order. Captain Chen, are you suggesting that humanity's primary contribution to galactic civilization would be as facilitators of interspecies cooperation? I'm suggesting that humanity's greatest strength isn't our technology or our military capability, Sarah replied. It's our ability to see potential partnerships where other species see only competition or irrelevance. Rex had finished his exploration and returned to Sarah's side. He sat down and looked up at her, sensing that something important was happening even if he couldn't understand what it was. Sarah reached down and gently picked him up, holding him so that the assembly could see him clearly. This puppy will grow up to be one of the most effective predators on Earth, she said. He'll be able to track scents across vast distances, detect threats that humans can't perceive, and, if necessary, fight to protect his pack. But he'll choose to use those abilities to help humans, not because we've forced him to, but because we've built a relationship based on mutual benefit and genuine affection. She looked directly at Representative THYSSK. You're right that humans are predators, Representative. But you're wrong about what that means. We're not predators who hunt other sapient species. We're predators who hunt the things that threaten our pack. And if humanity is accepted into the Galactic Council, that pack will include every member species represented in this hall. The silence that followed was different from the earlier quiet. This wasn't the silence of attention, but the silence of consideration. Sarah could see representatives throughout the hall exchanging glances, accessing data, having rapid conversations in their native languages. High Arbitrator Vexhai spoke slowly. Captain Chen, you present an unusual perspective on humanity's role in galactic civilization. The Council will need time to consider your statements and their implications. Of course, Honored Arbitrator, Sarah replied. But, before you adjourn, I'd like to make one final point. She set Rex down on the floor, where he immediately began wagging his tail at the assembled aliens. Several representatives who had initially seemed wary of the small animal were now watching him with what appeared to be curiosity rather than concern. You've spent 3 years evaluating humanity's potential threat to galactic civilization, Sarah said. But, have you spent any time considering the potential threats that humanity might help the Council face? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Representative THYSSK was the first to respond. What threats, Captain Chen? The galaxy has been at peace for over 2 centuries. Sarah's expression grew serious. Representative THYSSK, peace doesn't mean the absence of danger. It means the absence of recognized danger. And, sometimes, the greatest threats are the ones that existing defensive strategies aren't equipped to handle. She gestured to Rex, who was now lying down with his head on his paws, watching the proceedings with the patient attention of a young predator learning about his environment. Humans have survived on a world where almost everything was trying to kill us, Sarah continued. We've learned to recognize threats that other species might miss, to find solutions where other approaches have failed, and to adapt our strategies when the situation changes. Representative Korth spoke up. Are you suggesting that the Galactic Council faces unrecognized threats? I'm suggesting that any civilization that hasn't faced a significant challenge in 2 centuries might be less prepared for one than they think, Sarah replied diplomatically. Humans have experience with adaptation under pressure. We've learned to thrive in situations where other species might struggle. High Arbitrator Vexhai considered this carefully. Captain Chen, the Council appreciates your perspective. However, the evaluation of humanity's application for membership must be based on evidence rather than hypothetical scenarios. Sarah nodded. Of course, Honored Arbitrator. I understand completely. But, as she spoke, alarms began blaring throughout the station. Emergency lighting activated, bathing the Grand Assembly Hall in strobing red light. The universal translation system crackled with urgent messages in dozens of languages. Rex immediately jumped to his feet, his ears perked and his body tense. He moved to position himself between Sarah and the nearest exit, his puppy playfulness replaced by focused alertness. High Arbitrator Vexhai's voice cut through the chaos. This session is suspended pending resolution of the emergency. All representatives please remain in your seats while security determines the nature of the threat. Sarah looked down at Rex, who was now scanning the hall with an intensity that seemed almost adult. His nose was working constantly, processing sense and information that the station's sensors might miss. The galaxy was about to discover that sometimes, the most important questions were answered by circumstances rather than deliberation. And, sometimes, the greatest threats arrived at exactly the moment when everyone was focused on something else entirely. The emergency klaxons continued to wail as Nexus Security Chief Vortash burst into the Grand Assembly Hall. His forearms moved in rapid gestures as he addressed High Arbitrator Vexhai, his usually calm demeanor replaced by barely controlled panic. Honored Arbitrator, he said, his voice carrying clearly despite the chaos, we have an unprecedented situation. Long-range sensors have detected 17 unidentified vessels approaching the Nexus. They do not respond to hails and show no energy signatures matching any known technology. Representative THYSSK uncoiled from her seat, her serpentine body rising to its full height. Define unidentified, Security Chief. Are we dealing with a previously unknown species or potentially hostile technology? Both, Representative Vortash replied grimly. The vessels appear to be constructed from organic materials, but they're larger than any bioship in our databases. More concerning, they're moving at sublight speeds that should be impossible for organic constructs. Our physics models can't explain their propulsion method. Sarah remained in her seat, but she could feel Rex's tension increasing by the moment. The puppy had moved to stand directly in front of her, his body language screaming alerts that the sophisticated sensors throughout the station had apparently missed. His nose continued working, and she noticed he kept looking toward the ventilation systems. High Arbitrator Vexhai activated the hall's main display screen, showing the approaching vessels. Sarah felt her blood run cold as she saw them for the first time. The ships were massive, each one easily the size of a small moon, and they moved through space with an organic fluidity that made them look more like swimming creatures than constructed vessels. But what made them truly terrifying was their appearance. They were covered in what looked like chitinous plates, with long tendril-like appendages that writhed through the vacuum of space as if testing the environment. Bioluminescent patterns pulsed along their hulls in hypnotic sequences that hurt to look at directly. "Estimated time to arrival?" asked Representative Korth, his usual monotone somehow conveying urgency. 4 hours at current velocity, Vortash replied. "But, Security Chief, their approach pattern is unusual. They're not heading directly for the station. They're positioning themselves in a complex formation that our tactical analysts can't decipher." Sarah stood up slowly, her hand unconsciously moving to Rex's head. The puppy pressed against her leg, a low whine escaping his throat. In all the time she had known him, she had never seen him display this level of anxiety. "Security Chief Vortash," she said, her voice carrying across the hall, "what type of scans are you using to analyze these vessels?" Vortash turned toward her, confusion evident in his expression. "Standard sensor sweeps, Captain Chen. Electromagnetic, gravitational, quantum resonance, psionic detection arrays." "Why do you ask?" "Because you're missing something," Sarah replied, gesturing to Rex. "My companion has been showing signs of extreme agitation since the moment those ships entered sensor range. Dogs have senses that even advanced technology can't replicate. If he's this concerned, there's something about these vessels that your equipment isn't detecting." Representative Thwasiska's head swiveled toward Sarah with predatory grace. "Captain Chen, are you seriously suggesting that we should base our threat assessment on the behavior of a primitive Earth animal?" Before Sarah could respond, Rex suddenly stood up and barked once, sharply. The sound echoed through the Grand Assembly Hall with startling clarity. Then, he moved to the nearest wall and began pawing at a ventilation grate, whining urgently. "He's detecting something in the air circulation system," Sarah said, moving to kneel beside the puppy. She placed her hand on the grate and felt a subtle vibration. "There's something coming through the environmental systems." Security Chief Vortash immediately activated his communicator. "Environmental control, I need a full analysis of all atmospheric inputs to the Grand Assembly Hall. Priority override." The response came back within seconds, and the color drained from Vortash's face as he listened to the report. He looked up at the assembled representatives with an expression of disbelief. "The environmental systems are detecting trace amounts of an unknown organic compound," he announced. "It's being distributed through the ventilation network, but it's so minimal that it wouldn't have triggered automatic alerts for another 6 hours." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "What kind of compound?" "Unknown," Vortash replied. "But preliminary analysis suggests it might be some form of pheromone or biochemical agent." "Environmental control is implementing emergency atmospheric purging procedures now." Rex continued to pace nervously, his attention split between the ventilation system and the main display showing the approaching vessels. Sarah watched him carefully, noting the pattern of his behavior. His agitation wasn't random. He was tracking something, following scent trails that led from the air vents toward the main exits. "Security Chief," she said urgently, "I think we need to consider the possibility that these ships aren't just approaching the station. I think they're already here." The words had barely left her mouth when the station's artificial gravity fluctuated. For a moment, everything in the Grand Assembly Hall became weightless. Representatives floated from their seats, equipment drifted away from control surfaces, and Rex paddled frantically in the air until Sarah caught him. Then, the gravity returned with a crash that sent beings tumbling back to the floor throughout the hall. "What was that?" High Arbitrator Vexhai demanded. Vortash was frantically working his communication systems, but his expression grew increasingly grim with each report. "Multiple system failures throughout the station. Gravity control, atmospheric processing, artificial lighting, and communication arrays are all experiencing simultaneous malfunctions." "Simultaneous malfunctions don't happen," Representative Korth stated flatly. "This indicates coordinated sabotage or system infiltration." Sarah helped Rex back to the floor, noting that the puppy immediately resumed his anxious patrol of the nearby ventilation systems. But now his behavior had changed. Instead of simply showing agitation, he was displaying the focused alertness she had seen in adult dogs when they were tracking specific prey. Security Chief Vortash, she said, I think your unknown compound isn't a weapon. I think it's a tracking pheromone. Explain, High Arbitrator Vexhai commanded. Sarah looked around the hall, noting the positions of the various species representatives. Dogs you sent to mark territory and track prey. If these alien vessels are biological in nature, they might use similar methods. The compound in the air system could be marking specific targets for whatever is coming next. As if summoned by her words, a new sound began echoing through the station's corridors. It was unlike anything any of the assembled species had heard before, a rhythmic chittering mixed with harmonic resonances that seemed to bypass the auditory system entirely and vibrate through their bones. Rex's reaction was immediate and intense. He dropped into a crouch, his lips pulling back to reveal his small but sharp teeth. The playful puppy had been replaced by something much older and more primal, a creature whose genetic memory recognized the sound of an apex predator on the hunt. That's not a mechanical sound, Sarah said grimly. That's biological. And it's getting closer. The main display screen flickered and went dark. Emergency lighting activated throughout the hall, casting everything in an eerie red glow. In the distance, they could hear the sound of metal being torn apart, followed by that terrible chittering growing louder. Security Chief Vortash drew his energy weapon, though his hand was shaking slightly. All security teams, converge on the Grand Assembly Hall. We have hostile entities aboard the station. But, even as he spoke, the security team's responses came back fragmented and panicked. Reports of creatures moving through the corridors, beings that seemed to phase through solid barriers, entities that could apparently neutralize energy weapons before they could be fired. Representative THYSSK coiled herself into a defensive position, her species' natural camouflage abilities making her blend partially into the shadows. Captain Chan, if your companion's senses are superior to our technology, what is he telling us about our current situation? Sarah watched Rex carefully. The puppy was no longer focused on the ventilation system. Instead, he was watching the main entrances to the hall, his body language shifting between aggressive readiness and protective positioning around Sarah. He's telling us that whatever these things are, they're hunters, she said quietly. And they've found us. The chittering sound grew louder, accompanied now by a wet sliding noise that suggested something large moving across the station's surfaces. The emergency lighting began to flicker, creating a strobing effect that made shadows dance across the walls in disorienting patterns. Then, the temperature began to drop. Environmental systems are failing, Representative Korth observed, his breath now visible in the increasingly cold air. Whatever these entities are, their presence is causing systematic breakdown of station infrastructure. High Arbitrator Vexhai activated the emergency protocols, sealing the Grand Assembly Hall's blast doors. But, even as the massive barriers slammed shut, they could hear something testing the barriers from outside, not attacking them directly, but probing for weaknesses with methodical patience. How long will the blast doors hold? Asked Representative THYSSK. Vortash checked his tactical display, but the readings made no sense. According to sensors, there's nothing outside the doors. But acoustic analysis suggests something is definitely there. The readings are contradictory. Sarah knelt down beside Rex, who had moved to position himself between her and the sealed entrance. The puppy's behavior had shifted again. His aggressive stance had been replaced by something she recognized from watching adult dogs protect their humans, alert, focused, and absolutely ready to fight despite being vastly outmatched. They're not just hunters, she said, understanding flooding through her. They're pack hunters. And they're smart enough to understand that trapped prey is easier to handle than prey that can run. As if responding to her words, the probing sounds outside the blast doors suddenly stopped. The hall fell silent except for the labored breathing of the assembled representatives and the gradual failure of the life support systems. Then, without warning, the chittering sound began again. But, this time, it was coming from above them. Everyone looked up to see sections of the ceiling beginning to buckle and warp. Whatever was up there was large, strong, and patient enough to work its way through the station's superstructure rather than trying to force the blast doors. They're coming through the maintenance levels, Vortash whispered. Rex barked once, a sharp warning that made several representatives jump. Then, he moved to stand directly beneath the section of ceiling that was showing the most distortion, his small body tense with readiness. Security Chief, Sarah said urgently, do you have any weapons that might be effective against biological entities? Energy weapons, projectile weapons, plasma cannons, Vortash replied, checking his equipment. But our security teams reported that energy weapons had no effect on these creatures. What about physical barriers? Electrified barriers? Chemical deterrents? Limited options, Vortash admitted. The station wasn't designed for biological threats of this nature. Sarah looked around the assembly hall, taking inventory of resources and possible defensive positions. The hall was spacious but offered few places to take cover. The representatives came from a wide variety of species, but few of them appeared to have any combat capability. Then, she noticed something that made her pause. Rex wasn't just positioning himself defensively. He was moving in a pattern, circling beneath the compromised ceiling section while keeping his attention fixed on specific points. His behavior reminded her of something she had seen in nature documentaries, the way pack predators coordinated their movements when preparing for a coordinated strike. Security Chief Vortash, she said slowly, these creatures might be pack hunters, but that means they have pack instincts. They'll have established roles, coordination patterns, and probably a hierarchy. What are you suggesting, Captain Chen? Sarah watched Rex complete another circuit beneath the ceiling. The puppy's movement pattern was becoming clearer. He wasn't just randomly positioning himself, he was calculating angles and timing, preparing for something. I'm suggesting that pack hunters have weaknesses as well as strengths, she replied. They rely on coordination and established patterns. If you can disrupt their coordination or force them to operate outside their preferred patterns, they become much less effective. The ceiling buckled further, and pieces of debris began falling into the hall. Through the gaps, they could see movement, dark, glistening shapes that seemed to flow like liquid while maintaining solid form. Representative HFY Sci-Fi hissed, her species' danger response activated by the sight of the alien hunters. Captain Chen, your theoretical knowledge of pack hunting behavior is interesting, but, unless you have specific tactical recommendations, it's not particularly helpful. Sarah looked down at Rex, who had stopped moving and was now crouched in a specific position beneath the largest gap in the ceiling. His eyes were fixed upward, his body coiled like a spring, and his expression had shifted to something she had never seen before, the focused intensity of a predator who had identified his target and was waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Actually, Representative HFY Sci-Fi, Sarah said quietly, I think I might. The ceiling gave way with a thunderous crash, and the first of the alien hunters dropped into the Grand Assembly Hall. The creature that dropped through the ceiling defied every classification system the Galactic Council had developed over millennia of contact with alien species. It was roughly humanoid in shape but stood nearly 3 meters tall, with limbs that seemed to shift between solid flesh and flowing liquid depending on the angle of observation. Its skin appeared to be covered in chitinous plates that rippled with bioluminescent patterns, creating a hypnotic display that made it difficult to focus on the creature's exact position. But what made it truly terrifying were its eyes, compound visual organs that tracked each being in the hall simultaneously, processing information with an intelligence that was clearly sapient and unmistakably hostile. The creature's arrival triggered immediate panic among the assembled representatives. Being scattered toward the sealed blast doors, others activated personal defense systems, and several species began broadcasting emergency signals that their equipment couldn't transmit through the station's compromised communication arrays. Rex didn't move. The small German Shepherd puppy remained crouched in his position beneath the hole in the ceiling, his attention fixed on the alien hunter with laser-like intensity. To everyone else in the hall, the creature appeared to be a terrifying apex predator that had materialized without warning. But Rex was seeing something different: patterns of movement, positioning relative to potential escape routes, and, most importantly, the subtle hesitation that suggested this creature was as surprised by the situation as everyone else. Sarah watched her companion's behavior and felt a cold realization wash over her. Security Chief Vortash, she said quietly, not taking her eyes off Rex, this creature isn't attacking. What? Vortash replied, his energy weapon trained on the alien hunter. Captain Chen, it just broke through our defenses and invaded the Grand Assembly Hall. But it's not attacking, Sarah repeated. Look at its positioning. It dropped through the ceiling, but it hasn't moved toward any of the representatives. It's standing in the center of the hall, tracking everyone present but not advancing on anyone. She was right. Despite the panic around it, the creature remained motionless except for the constant movement of its compound eyes. The bioluminescent patterns on its chitinous plates continued to pulse in complex sequences, but the rhythm seemed more like communication than aggression. Representative HFY Sci-Fi, still coiled in her defensive position, hissed softly. If it's not attacking, Captain Chen, then what is it doing? Before Sarah could answer, more sounds echoed from the corridors outside the blast doors, the wet sliding movement they had heard before, but now accompanied by different types of chittering. The sounds suggested multiple creatures moving in coordinated patterns through the station's passages. Rex's ears twitched as he processed the audio information, and Sarah saw his body language shift subtly. The aggressive tension remained, but it was now mixed with something that looked almost like curiosity. I think it's scouting, Sarah said slowly. Pack hunters often send scouts ahead to assess threats and identify the most vulnerable targets. This creature isn't here to attack us, it's here to learn about us. High Arbitrator Vexhai, who had remained surprisingly calm throughout the crisis, spoke directly to the alien hunter. Unknown entity, I am High Arbitrator Vexhai of the Galactic Council. If you are capable of communication, we wish to establish peaceful contact. The creature's compound eyes focused on Vexhai, and the bioluminescent patterns on its body shifted to new configurations. For a moment, it seemed as if some form of communication might be possible. Then, Rex growled. It was a low, rumbling sound that seemed far too mature for a 6-month-old puppy. The growl carried undertones that made every being in the hall feel an instinctive chill, the sound of a predator warning another predator to back away from its territory. The alien creature's reaction was immediate and startling. Its compound eyes snapped to focus on Rex, and the bioluminescent patterns on its body shifted to configurations that pulsed much more rapidly. For the first time since entering the hall, the creature moved, but, instead of advancing, it took a step backward. Fascinating, Representative Korth observed in his monotone. The entity appears to recognize the Earth canine as a threat. Sarah felt a surge of protective instinct, but she forced herself to remain still. Rex's behavior was telling her something important, and interrupting him now could disrupt whatever was happening between the two predators. The standoff continued for several tense moments. The alien hunter remained focused on Rex, its body language shifting in ways that suggested it was reassessing the situation. Rex maintained his warning posture, but Sarah noticed that his positioning had changed slightly. He was no longer crouched defensively, he was standing in a stance that clearly communicated readiness to attack. Then, the creature did something unexpected. It tilted its head in a gesture that was unmistakably curious, and the chittering sound it made changed to a different frequency, one that sounded almost questioning. Rex's response was equally surprising. His growl stopped, and he tilted his head in mirror of the alien's gesture. The two predators studied each other across the space of the Grand Assembly Hall, engaged in some form of communication that bypassed language entirely. Captain Chen, whispered Representative Thysska, what is happening? Sarah watched the interaction with growing understanding. They're recognizing each other, she said quietly. Rex is displaying behavior I've never seen before, but it looks like he's acknowledging the creature as another predator. And the creature is responding to him as if he's something more than just a small Earth animal. Security Chief Vortash kept his weapon trained on the alien hunter, but his expression showed confusion. Captain Chen, that creature is 3 meters tall and appears to possess capabilities far beyond anything in our databases. How can a puppy represent any kind of threat to it? Before Sarah could answer, the creature did something that made everyone in the hall freeze. It lowered itself into a crouch that mirrored Rex's earlier position, bringing its compound eyes to approximately the same level as the puppy's head. The gesture was clearly deliberate, a sign of respect between equals. Rex stepped forward. Rex, no, Sarah whispered, but the puppy ignored her. He walked slowly toward the alien creature, his body language shifting from aggressive readiness to cautious investigation. When he was about 2 meters away, he sat down and looked up at the hunter. The creature extended one of its appendages, a limb that seemed to shift between solid flesh and flowing liquid as it moved. Rex sniffed the extended appendage carefully, his nose working to process information that no technological sensor could detect. Then, he wagged his tail. The gesture was so normal, so typically dog-like, that it created a moment of cognitive dissonance for everyone watching. Here was a small Earth puppy, sitting calmly in front of a terrifying alien predator, wagging his tail as if he had just met a new friend. But the alien creature's response was even more surprising. The bioluminescent patterns on its body shifted to configurations that pulsed in rhythm with Rex's tail movements. The chittering sound it made took on harmonious tones that suggested pleasure or approval. I don't believe what I'm seeing, Representative Thysska said softly. High Arbitrator Vexhai spoke carefully. Captain Shan, can you explain this interaction? Sarah knelt down slowly, moving toward Rex and the alien creature with deliberate calm. I think they're recognizing each other as fellow predators, she said. But, more than that, I think they're recognizing each other as intelligent predators. Rex isn't just responding to the creature's physical presence, he's responding to its intelligence. She reached Rex's side and gently placed her hand on his head. The puppy leaned into her touch but kept his attention focused on the alien hunter. The creature's compound eyes tracked her movement, but it made no aggressive gestures. Dogs have co-evolved with humans for thousands of years, Sarah continued. They've developed the ability to recognize and communicate with intelligence that's different from their own. Rex isn't seeing this creature as a threat to be fought, he's seeing it as a potential pack member to be evaluated. Representative Korth processed this information with his characteristic analytical approach. Captain Chen, are you suggesting that your companion is attempting to recruit an unknown alien entity into his social structure? I'm suggesting that both of them are operating on instincts that are older and more sophisticated than our technology, Sarah replied. Pack dynamics aren't just about hierarchy, they're about recognizing compatible strengths and forming alliances that benefit everyone involved. The alien creature made a new sound, a complex harmony of chittering and resonant tones that seemed to incorporate elements of Rex's earlier growl. Rex responded with a soft bark that somehow harmonized with the creature's vocalizations. Then, both predators turned to look at the assembled representatives. The change in their attention was immediately apparent to everyone in the hall. Where before the alien hunter had been tracking individual beings as potential threats or prey, now both creatures were scanning the assembly with what appeared to be protective assessment. They're evaluating us as potential pack members, Sarah realized aloud. Rex has communicated that humans and their allies are under his protection, and the creature is acknowledging that relationship. Security Chief Vortash lowered his weapon slightly. Captain Chen, are you saying that your puppy has just negotiated some kind of truce with an unknown alien species? Before Sarah could answer, the sounds from the corridors outside began to change. The wet sliding movement continued, but the chittering sounds took on new harmonies that matched the patterns they had heard from the creature in the hall. One by one, the alien hunters throughout the station began responding to their scouts' communications. Rex stood up and walked back to Sarah's side, but his demeanor had changed completely. The anxiety and alertness were gone, replaced by the confident posture of a dog who had successfully defended his territory and established new pack relationships. The alien creature straightened to its full height and made a series of complex vocalizations toward the hole in the ceiling. The response came immediately, answering calls from throughout the station that suggested dozens of similar beings acknowledging new orders. The attacks have stopped, Vortash reported, checking his security feeds. All hostile activity throughout the station has ceased. The creatures are withdrawing to defensive positions but are no longer advancing on any areas with Council personnel. High Arbitrator Vexhai approached Sarah and Rex slowly. Captain Chen, what exactly has transpired here? Sarah looked down at Rex, who was now sitting calmly beside her with his tail wagging gently. The puppy looked up at her with bright, intelligent eyes that seemed to be asking if he had done well. I think, Sarah said carefully, that we've just witnessed the first successful first contact scenario between species that communicate primarily through pack dynamics rather than language. She gestured to the alien creature, which remained in the center of the hall but had shifted its posture to something that seemed less threatening. These beings aren't invaders in the way we understand invasion. They're a nomadic pack looking for new territory and resources. When they detected the station, they moved to investigate and claim it according to their natural instincts. Representative THYSSK uncoiled slightly from her defensive position. But why did they stop when confronted by your companion? Because Rex communicated with them in a language they understood, Sarah replied. He established that this territory was already claimed by an organized pack and that the current inhabitants were under the protection of that pack's hierarchy. She knelt down to scratch behind Rex's ears, and the puppy leaned into the gesture with obvious pleasure. Dogs have been pack mediators for thousands of years. They've learned to negotiate territorial disputes, establish hierarchies, and create alliances between groups that might otherwise fight each other. The alien creature made another complex vocalization, and Rex responded with a sequence of barks that seemed to incorporate elements of the creature's tonal patterns. The interaction lasted several moments, with both beings appearing to exchange detailed information. When they finished, Rex walked over to High Arbitrator Vexhai and sat down directly in front of the insectoid leader. Then, he looked back at the alien creature and barked once. The creature approached Vexai slowly, stopping at a respectful distance. It extended one of its appendages in what was clearly a gesture of greeting or acknowledgement. "I believe," Sarah said with amazement, "that Rex just introduced the alien leader to our pack leader. They're trying to establish formal diplomatic relations." High Arbitrator Vexai looked down at the small puppy, then up at the towering alien hunter. After a moment of consideration, he extended one of his own appendages toward the creature. The first formal contact between the Galactic Council and the beings who would eventually be known as the Void Shepherds was initiated by a 6-month-old German Shepherd puppy who understood that sometimes the best way to prevent a fight was to establish that everyone involved was on the same side. But, as Sarah watched the careful diplomatic dance beginning between the two leaders, Rex suddenly tensed again. His ears perked up, his nose began working frantically, and he looked toward the blast doors with an expression of concern that made Sarah's blood run cold. Something else was coming. And, this time, Rex's body language suggested that it was something that even successful pact negotiations might not be able to handle. The change in Rex's demeanor was immediate and unmistakable. Where moments before he had been calm and confident, now every line of his small body screamed danger. His ears flattened against his head, his tail stopped wagging entirely, and a low whine escaped his throat, the sound of a creature recognizing a threat beyond his ability to handle. The alien creature that had been attempting diplomatic contact with High Arbitrator Vexai suddenly straightened to its full height, its compound eyes swiveling toward the blast doors. The bioluminescent patterns on its chitinous plates shifted to rapid, staccato flashes that looked nothing like the earlier communication displays. This was clearly an alarm response. "What is it?" Sarah asked, kneeling beside Rex and placing a protective hand on his trembling form. The puppy pressed against her leg, seeking comfort while keeping his attention fixed on whatever had triggered his fear response. The alien creature made a series of harsh, discordant sounds that bore no resemblance to the earlier harmonious communications. From throughout the station, similar alarm calls began echoing back, dozens of the Void Shepherds responding with what could only be described as panic. Security Chief Vortash frantically worked his communication systems, trying to re-establish contact with his scattered security teams. "I'm getting fragmentary reports from throughout the station," he announced. "The alien creatures that had withdrawn to defensive positions are now fleeing. They're abandoning entire sections and moving toward the outer hull." Representative THYSSK coiled herself into her tightest defensive position. "Fleeing from what, Security Chief?" Before Vortash could respond, the station's superstructure groaned with a sound that made everyone's bones ache. It was the sound of metal being twisted beyond its design limits, but amplified to a scale that suggested something enormous was manipulating the station itself. High Arbitrator Vexai accessed the external sensor array, and the main display screen flickered back to life. What they saw made several representatives gasp in horror. The 17 organic vessels they had detected earlier were no longer approaching the station. They were already here, having somehow moved to surround the Nexus without triggering proximity alarms. But these ships weren't the same vessels they had observed on long-range sensors. They were larger, darker, and covered in appendages that were currently attached to the station's hull like the feeding tentacles of some cosmic parasite. "They're not ships," Representative Korth observed with his characteristic analytical detachment. "They're organisms. Living creatures capable of surviving and moving through the vacuum of space." Sarah watched Rex's continued distress with growing alarm. The puppy was now actively trembling, his nose working constantly as he processed scents that the station's atmospheric systems couldn't detect. His behavior reminded her of how dogs reacted to natural disasters, earthquakes, tornadoes, and other environmental threats that they could sense long before human technology registered any danger. "Security Chief Vortash," she said urgently, "what's the status of the station's structural integrity?" Vortash checked his readings, and his expression grew increasingly grim. "Catastrophic degradation throughout multiple sections. Whatever these organisms are doing to the hull, they're compromising the station's ability to maintain life support, artificial gravity, and structural cohesion." The alien creature in the hull made another series of harsh vocalizations, and Rex responded with a sharp bark that sounded more like a warning than communication. Then, both predators moved to position themselves between the assembled representatives and the blast doors. "They're forming a defensive perimeter," Sarah realized. Both of them recognize that something is coming through those doors, and they're preparing to fight it. Representative THYSSK's serpentine head swiveled toward Sarah. Captain Chen, if these void shepherds are fleeing from whatever is coming, what makes you think that one creature and a puppy can provide any meaningful defense? Sarah watched Rex's positioning carefully. The puppy had moved to a specific spot near the blast doors, his body language indicating that he was prepared to attack something much larger than himself. But his positioning wasn't random, he was calculating angles and timing, just as he had done earlier when the first void shepherd had entered the hall. Because they're not planning to win, Sarah said quietly. They're planning to buy time. The blast doors, which had withstood every attempt to breach them from outside, suddenly began to buckle inward. But the force wasn't coming from the corridor beyond, it was coming from something that was reshaping the station's structure around the doors, bypassing their defenses entirely. High Arbitrator Vexhai activated the emergency evacuation protocols, but the system responses indicated that escape pods and emergency shuttles throughout the station were non-functional. Whatever was attacking the Nexus had systematically disabled every possible means of escape. We're trapped, Vortash announced grimly. All evacuation routes have been compromised. External communication arrays are down. We're completely cut off from any potential rescue. The temperature in the hall began to drop rapidly as the station's life support systems failed. Emergency lighting flickered and dimmed, casting everything in an increasingly weak red glow. In the distance, they could hear the sound of atmospheric systems venting into space as hull breaches spread throughout the structure. But what made the situation truly terrifying was the new sound that began echoing through the corridors, a rhythmic pulsing that seemed to come from the station's walls themselves. It was the sound of something vast and alien moving through the Nexus's superstructure, reshaping it according to some incomprehensible purpose. Rex's response to this new sound was unlike anything Sarah had ever seen from him. The puppy suddenly stopped trembling and stood up straight, his ears perked and his attention focused with laser-like intensity. His body language shifted from fear to something that looked almost like recognition. "What is it, boy?" Sarah asked softly. Rex looked up at her, and, for a moment, she saw something in his eyes that seemed far older and more knowing than any 6-month-old puppy should possess. Then, he walked calmly to the center of the hall and sat down, facing the compromised blast doors. The alien void shepherd watched Rex's movement and made a soft, questioning sound. Rex responded with a single, quiet bark that somehow conveyed more meaning than words could express. Then, both predators sat down and waited. "What are they doing?" Representative THYSSK whispered. Sarah stared at her companion, understanding beginning to dawn. "I think they're surrendering." "Surrendering?" Vortash repeated. "To what?" Before Sarah could answer, the blast doors simply ceased to exist. There was no explosion, no tearing of metal, the massive barriers just dissolved as if they had never been there, revealing the corridor beyond. What emerged from that corridor defied every concept of biology, physics, and reality that the Galactic Council had developed over millennia of scientific advancement. It was simultaneously enormous and impossibly contained within the station's passages, clearly organic but operating according to physical laws that made no sense. The entity flowed into the Grand Assembly Hall like liquid shadow given form and purpose. It had no fixed shape. One moment it appeared as a massive serpentine creature covered in scales that reflected impossible colors, the next it seemed to be a cloud of sentient darkness punctuated by eyes that burned with stellar fire. But what made it truly alien was its presence. Every being in the hall could feel it pressing against their consciousness, not trying to communicate but simply existing with such intensity that awareness of it overwhelmed every other thought. Rex stood up and walked directly toward the entity. "Rex, no!" Sarah screamed, lunging forward to grab her companion. But the puppy was already beyond her reach, padding calmly toward the cosmic horror that had just materialized in the Grand Assembly Hall. When he was about a meter away from the shifting, impossible form, he sat down and looked up at it. The entity's attention focused on the small earth animal, and the oppressive presence that had been crushing everyone's consciousness suddenly lifted. The burning eyes that had been scattered throughout its shifting form coalesced into a configuration that resembled a face ancient beyond measure, intelligent beyond comprehension, and curious about the small creature that had approached it without fear. Rex barked once. The sound echoed through the hall with perfect clarity, but it carried harmonics that hadn't been there before, frequencies that seemed to resonate with the entity's impossible presence. The bark was followed by a response from the cosmic being that wasn't quite sound and wasn't quite telepathy, but somehow conveyed meaning directly to everyone present. Query: Packbond entity displays no fear response. Explain asterisk the words appeared in everyone's consciousness without being spoken, translated automatically into each being's native thought patterns. The entity wasn't just communicating, it was demonstrating cognitive capabilities that operated on levels far beyond anything the Galactic Council had encountered. Rex tilted his head and made a soft whining sound that somehow conveyed complex information. The entity's burning eyes focused more intently on the puppy, and its shifting form stabilized into something that resembled a massive canine shape, not quite wolf, not quite dog, but something that contained elements of both. Understanding, you recognize kinship. Pack leader seeks confirmation. Asterisk Sarah found herself standing and walking toward Rex, driven by an instinct she couldn't name. The entity's attention shifted to her, and she felt the full weight of its consciousness examining her with microscopic intensity. Query: human entity claims authority over pack bond entity. Demonstrate dominance. Asterisk the challenge was unmistakable, but Sarah realized that the entity wasn't asking her to prove her strength. It was asking her to prove her relationship with Rex. She knelt down beside her companion and gently scratched behind his ears. Rex leaned into the gesture with obvious pleasure, his tail wagging as he looked up at her with complete trust and affection. The simple interaction conveyed more about their relationship than any demonstration of dominance could have. Understanding, pack bond transcends species barriers. Human entity serves as pack leader through cooperation rather than conquest. Asterisk the entity's form shifted again, becoming less defined but somehow less threatening. The oppressive presence that had filled the hall was replaced by something that felt more like curiosity than hostility. High Arbitrator Vexhai found his voice. Unknown entity, I am High Arbitrator Vexhai of the Galactic Council. If you are capable of peaceful communication, we wish to establish dialogue. The entity's attention turned to Vexhai, but its response was directed toward Rex. Query: Pack leader of secondary pack requests acknowledgement. Pack bond entity, provide guidance. Asterisk Rex looked at Sarah, then at Vexhai, then back at the cosmic entity. He barked twice, walked over to Vexhai, and sat down beside the insectoid leader. Then he looked back at the entity and wagged his tail. Understanding, secondary pack operates under protection of primary pack. Territorial claim acknowledged. Asterisk Sarah felt a mixture of amazement and terror as she realized what was happening. Rex wasn't just communicating with this cosmic being, he was negotiating the survival of everyone in the hall by establishing pack relationships that the entity could understand and respect. But the negotiation wasn't over. The entity's form continued to shift, and its next communication carried undertones that suggested this was just the beginning of a much more complex interaction. Statement: Pack bond entity demonstrates appropriate protocols. However, larger pack concerns require resolution. Pack leaders of primary pack must demonstrate worthiness for expanded territorial claims. Asterisk the alien void shepherd in the hall made a series of urgent vocalizations, and Rex responded with a bark that carried harmonics matching the cosmic entity's communication frequencies. Both predators then looked at Sarah with expressions that somehow conveyed the same message. The real test was just beginning. The cosmic entity's form stabilized into something that resembled a massive canine constellation, stars burning where eyes should be and nebulae swirling through what might have been fur. Its presence filled the grand assembly hall with a sense of ancient patience that made everyone present feel as if they were being evaluated by time itself. Statement: Territorial expansion requires demonstration of pack cohesion and leadership capability. Primary pack leader will face challenge appropriate to species type. Success results in expanded territorial recognition. Failure results in territorial abandonment. Asterisk Sarah felt the weight of the entity's attention focusing on her with uncomfortable intensity. Rex moved to stand beside her, his small body pressed against her leg in a gesture of support that somehow made the cosmic being's scrutiny more bearable. What kind of challenge? She asked aloud, though she wasn't sure if the entity would respond to verbal communication. Response: Pack leader demonstrates worthiness by solving territorial dispute without violence. Secondary pack claims this territory through historical precedents. Primary pack claims territory through current occupation. Resolution must satisfy both claims while maintaining pack cohesion. Asterisk the entity gestured with appendages made of flowing starlight toward High Arbitrator Vexhai and the assembled representatives. Asterisk statement: Secondary pack demonstrates advanced cooperative capabilities but lacks expansion protocols suited for dynamic territorial environments. Primary pack demonstrates adaptability but lacks established frameworks for large-scale cooperation. Asterisk Sarah looked around the Grand Assembly Hall, taking in the diverse collection of alien species that represented the Galactic Council. Each being present had evolved on different worlds, developed different technologies, and approached cooperation from fundamentally different perspectives. Yet somehow, they had managed to work together for over 2 centuries. Then, she looked at Rex, who was watching her with the kind of patient attention that dogs gave their humans when they were waiting for important decisions. Beside him, the Void Shepherd Scout maintained its own alert posture, clearly ready to support whatever Sarah chose to do.
"You're not just talking about this station, are you?" Sarah said to the cosmic entity. "You're talking about the galaxy itself."
Confirmation: galactic territory requires management appropriate to its scale and complexity.
Current secondary pack management demonstrates competence for static territorial maintenance.
Dynamic territorial challenges require different approach. Representative THYSSK uncoiled slowly from her defensive position. Captain Chen, I believe this entity is suggesting that the Galactic Council's method of governance is insufficient for whatever challenges are coming.
And it's asking you to prove that humanity can provide a better alternative. The cosmic entity's stellar eyes focused on THYSSK with what might have been approval. Statement: Serpentine entity demonstrates accurate assessment.
Territorial challenges approaching require pack leadership adapted to rapid environmental changes and unprecedented threat scenarios. High Arbitrator Vexai stepped forward carefully. Unknown entity, the Galactic Council has maintained peace and stability for over 2 centuries.
What territorial challenges could require such dramatic changes to our established systems?
Instead of answering directly, the entity caused the main display screen to activate, showing a view of space beyond the Nexus station. What appeared on the screen made everyone in the hall freeze with shock. The familiar star patterns of local space were wrong.
Entire stellar systems were missing, replaced by expanding fields of absolute darkness that seemed to consume light itself.
As they watched, one of the nearby systems simply vanished, its star winking out as if it had never existed. Explanation: territorial expansion of non-cooperative entities proceeding at exponential rate.
Current secondary pack defensive protocols inadequate for threat scale.
Primary pack adaptability principles required for species survival. Sarah stared at the display, her mind struggling to process the implications.
How long do we have?
Response: temporal projection indicates non-cooperative entity arrival in this territorial region within local measurement of 18 solar cycles. Preparation requires immediate implementation of adaptive territorial management. 18 years. The galaxy had 18 years before whatever was consuming stellar systems reached this region of space. And, somehow, this cosmic entity believed that humanity's approach to cooperation and adaptation was the key to survival. Rex barked softly, drawing Sarah's attention back to the immediate situation. The puppy was looking at her with an expression that seemed to convey confidence in her ability to handle whatever was being asked of her.
"What exactly are you asking me to do?" Sarah asked the entity.
Response: demonstrate integration of static cooperative protocols with dynamic adaptation protocols. Merge secondary pack stability advantages with primary pack flexibility advantages. Create hybrid territorial management systems suitable for unprecedented challenge scenarios. Sarah looked around the assembly hall again, but this time she was seeing it differently. The Galactic Council had achieved something remarkable: hundreds of different species working together peacefully despite their vast differences. But their system was built on stability, consensus, and careful deliberation.
Humanity had a different approach.
Human societies had always been dynamic, adaptable, capable of rapid reorganization when circumstances changed. And humanity had learned to form partnerships not just with other humans, but with entirely different species. You want me to show how human pack dynamics can enhance council cooperation without destroying what makes the council effective, she said slowly. Confirmation: demonstration requires practical implementation under stress conditions. Immediate territorial dispute provides appropriate testing environment. The entity gestured again, and, suddenly, the Grand Assembly Hall was no longer just the Grand Assembly Hall. The space had somehow expanded to include representations of the entire Nexus station, the surrounding Void Shepherd vessels, and even the larger context of the approaching cosmic threat. Sarah found herself looking at a three-dimensional model of the current crisis that showed every detail from Rex's perspective as a pack animal, the Void Shepherd's perspective as territorial nomads, the Council's perspective as established civilization managers, and the cosmic entity's perspective as something far larger and older than any of them.
Challenge parameters: resolve immediate territorial dispute.
Integrate nomadic pack requirements with static civilization requirements.
Establish protocols for rapid adaptation to changing threat levels. Maintain cooperative relationships between all participating entities. Time limit, local measurement of 1 standard hour. Rex barked once and walked over to the display model. He sniffed at the representation of the Nexus station, then looked back at Sarah with an expression that clearly said, "Well, what are you going to do about this?" Sarah took a deep breath and stepped into the model. As she moved, she found that she could manipulate the representations with her thoughts, shifting configurations and testing different approaches to the complex problem. "All right," she said to the assembled beings. "The Void Shepherds need territory and resources for their nomadic lifestyle. The Council needs stability and security for their established systems. And all of us need to be able to adapt quickly when that cosmic threat arrives." She began moving elements of the model, showing how the Void Shepherds' mobility could be integrated with the Council's infrastructure. What if instead of seeing this as a territorial dispute, we see it as an opportunity for symbiosis? Representative THYSSK watched the model shift with growing interest. "Elaborate, Captain Chen." "The Void Shepherds are essentially nomadic explorers," Sarah explained, highlighting their vessels in the display. "They're perfect for reconnaissance, early warning systems, and rapid response to emerging threats. The Council has established infrastructure but limited ability to quickly respond to threats in remote regions." She showed how Void Shepherd vessels could be integrated into the Council's defense network, providing mobile platforms that could respond to threats while maintaining their nomadic nature. Instead of competing for the same resources, they could share different aspects of territorial management. High Arbitrator Vexhai studied the proposed configuration. "You're suggesting a permanent alliance rather than a temporary treaty." "I'm suggesting that we evolve past the concept of territorial disputes entirely," Sarah replied. "Pack dynamics aren't about controlling territory, they're about protecting pack members. What if we expand the definition of pack to include both nomadic and settled members?" Rex barked approvingly and moved to a position in the model that represented the interface between Council space and unexplored regions. The Void Shepherd scout joined him, and together they began displaying movement patterns that showed how mobile and static elements could work together. Assessment: Primary pack leader demonstrates appropriate synthesis of cooperative protocols. Continue demonstration with stress scenario implementation. The entity modified the model to include representations of the approaching cosmic threat. Suddenly, the theoretical cooperation Sarah had proposed was tested against simulations of system-consuming entities advancing through space at exponential rates. "Security Chief Vortash," Sarah said, "what are the Council's current protocols for responding to system-wide threats?" Vortash consulted his tactical databases. Evacuation to designated safe zones, deployment of defensive fleets to establish choke points, and activation of emergency communication networks to coordinate resistance. "Static defense," Sarah observed. "Predictable, organized, but inflexible if the threat doesn't behave according to your assumptions." She showed how the Void Shepherd's mobility could provide dynamic scouting and harassment capabilities that would complement the Council's organized defenses. "But what if we combine that with adaptive response protocols?" She began demonstrating hybrid tactics that used Council infrastructure to support Void Shepherd mobility while using Void Shepherd reconnaissance to guide Council strategic decisions. The model showed how such cooperation could potentially outmaneuver threats that had evolved specifically to counter static defensive strategies. Representative Korth processed the simulation data with his characteristic analytical approach. "Captain Chan, your proposed integration demonstrates significant tactical advantages, but it requires unprecedented levels of real-time cooperation between radically different organizational structures." "Which is where human pack dynamics become relevant," Sarah replied. "Humans have been adapting to work with different types of intelligence for thousands of years. We know how to maintain pack cohesion while allowing individual members to operate according to their own strengths." She gestured to Rex, who was now moving through the model in patterns that showed how a pack coordinator could maintain awareness of both static and mobile elements simultaneously. "Dogs learn to work with human strategic thinking while maintaining their own predatory instincts. They became something new, not human, not wolf, but a synthesis that was more effective than either species alone." Query: Primary pack leader proposes species synthesis as solution to territorial challenges. I'm proposing that cooperation doesn't require anyone to give up what makes them effective, Sarah clarified. The Council doesn't need to become nomadic, and the Void Shepherds don't need to become static. But both groups can become part of something larger that incorporates the strengths of each approach.
She showed how the model could be expanded beyond the immediate crisis to include other species types: explorers, builders, warriors, diplomats, scientists, each contributing according to their abilities while benefiting from the protection and resources of the larger pack. High Arbitrator Vexhai studied the comprehensive display with growing understanding. "You're describing a fundamental restructuring of galactic civilization."
"I'm describing evolution," Sarah replied. "Species that can adapt survive.
Species that can't adapt get consumed by cosmic entities that eat star systems." Rex barked twice and moved to the center of the model, where he sat down in a position that somehow represented the integration point for all the different elements Sarah had demonstrated. The Void Shepherd Scout joined him, and both predators looked expectantly at the cosmic entity. Assessment: Primary Pack Leader demonstrates acceptable integration of static and dynamic territorial management protocols. Implementation testing required before territorial expansion authorization. The entity began collapsing the model back to the actual Grand Assembly Hall, but the representations of integrated cooperation remained visible as overlays on reality. Sarah found herself looking at the same collection of alien beings she had addressed hours earlier, but now she could see the potential connections between them, the ways their different abilities could be combined into something greater than the sum of their parts. "Honored Arbitrator," she said formally, "I request that the Galactic Council consider a new approach to membership evaluation. Instead of asking whether humanity deserves to join the Council, perhaps we should be asking how all of our species can work together to face what's coming." Representative THYSSK uncoiled completely and moved to stand beside High Arbitrator Vexhai. "Captain Shan, what you're proposing would require changes to institutions that have maintained stability for centuries."
Representative THYSSK, Sarah replied gently, "In 18 years, those institutions might not exist anymore.
But the species that created them could survive if they're willing to evolve."
The cosmic entity's stellar eyes focused on the assembled representatives. Statement: Demonstration period concluded.
Territorial expansion authorization requires consensus of all participating pack entities. Decision implementation affects survival probability of all species within territorial boundaries. High Arbitrator Vexhai looked around the assembly hall, taking in the faces of representatives.